Hi everybody, this is Jamie from the Unlikely Homeschool. Yesterday my family and I had the privilege of venturing out together to a local state park to do some hiking along the hiking trails. And as we're hiking along several times throughout the day, we came upon some rivers and some streams, all of which had little bridges that were covering them. And as is our habit as a family, whenever we would see a bridge up ahead, we'd clamber to the edge of the woods to all find a stick or a twig, and then we'd run to the bridge and line up along the bridge, and we'd enjoy a few minutes of the game Pooh Sticks. And that's a game we've been playing for several years together, ever since we read A.A. Milne's classic, Winnie the Pooh. And because we read that lovely story together, now that game is a part of our family culture, our family language. If you are a regular reader of my blog, you know that I love books, but you also know that I write a monthly post called What We're Reading. And in that post, I detail some of the books that my kids are reading, some of the books that I'm reading, some of the books that we're all enjoying together. And ever since I started that series about 2 years ago, I've received numerous questions from moms who have a heart to develop a passion for reading in their kids and a love for reading and a love for reading as a family culture. Most of those questions and comments that I receive actually can be whittled down to two most common asked questions. And so I'd like to just take a few minutes today and tackle both of those in order to help other mothers who would like to establish a family culture centered on great books. The first, most frequently asked question I receive is, where do I go or how do I find book lists that I can trust in order to find great books for my kids to read? I wrote a post many months ago about why I don't let my children read very many award-winning books, and that post has spurned a lot of dialogue and conversation, some of which goes like this. Well, if I can't trust the experts to choose quality literature for my kids, who can I trust? What are some go-to lists that I can count on and that I know come from reputable resources that will give me some great book suggestions for my kids? I really do have lots of thoughts to share about that in several resources and several links to give you, but unfortunately with a video I can't provide a link within a video. So at the end of this, if you would head to the comments section here on YouTube below the video, I will provide a link to a blog post, and in that blog post I hope to share a lot of tons of resources and books, great books about books, and the names of different resources and people that you can trust for some of those go-to book lists for your kids. The second most frequently asked question on my blog regarding reading is, what should reading look like in my home? What does it look like in your home? Give me some how-tos about how to formulate that culture of reading within my home. Now, I'll say this to start out with. My home is going to look different than yours. My homeschool will look different than yours. And so I'm going to give you just a brief glimpse into what our reading time looks like together. But please remember that your reading time is going to look different. And in actuality, my reading time looks different year by year and season by season, because as my kids get older, or maybe I have another baby or I have a toddler in the home, our reading time has to ebb and flow based on life. And so this is just a sampling, one way of how we're currently doing reading time and currently immersing our day in literature. But it's just one sample. It's just one way. First and foremost, I think you should know that I require my kids to have 2 books going every month. They have to be reading 2 different books. The first is a mom-assigned book, and that's a book that I've pre-selected for them with intentionality and purpose. I know their interest level. I know their reading level. I know of some topics that I feel like they eventually need to come upon and need to explore. And so with purpose, I select 1 book for each of my kids that they should complete within a reasonable amount of time, usually the length of a month. They have to read 1 chapter of that book every day. My daughter, who is at the reading to learn phase of her education, can have the privilege of reading that book completely independently from me. I trust that she's reading it. She reads a chapter a day. We actually have lots of conversation about all of her books, and so I leave that to her to read independently. My sons, on the other hand, 3 out of the 4 of them, the ones who are currently reading, they have to read a chapter out loud to me from their mom assigned reader each and every day, because they're in the phase of their education where they're still actually learning to read, and they're each at different journeys of that phase. Some of them are reading a little bit better than others, but because they're still developing those reading skills, those primary foundational skills of reading, they have to read out loud to me 1 chapter every day. I don't necessarily have a set time in our schedule where I would call this is our reading time. I try to schedule those in pockets throughout the day where I can also be working on something else to sort of utilize my time more efficiently. So when they're reading out loud to me, I'm doing something like the dishes or folding laundry, or maybe I'm writing out bills. I still have an ear open to what they're reading, and I can comment and converse and make some suggestions, but I'm also doing something else. During that mom and me reading aloud time, I don't have a lot of extras that I include with that. I don't give them comprehension questions. They don't write book reports. There's not a lot of extra activities, because the point of reading is reading. And when we take too much time to do all of these extras, we're actually limiting the amount of time that we can dedicate to just the sheer art of reading. We do a little bit of discussion, but it's very limited. I am not a big advocate in homeschooling for book reports. I think book reports have their place, and I think every child should eventually learn how to write a book report and use and be articulate in the written word in describing their book and their opinion of their book. And that's a skill that all kids should master. But I don't think book reports, as a general rule, really have a place in homeschooling. They're really designed for a traditional classroom where a teacher doesn't have enough time in her day to sit down with each individual child to determine whether or not they're comprehending their book or whether or not they're even reading their book. So it's really more of a traditional classroom activity, and I don't think it has a whole lot of validity within homeschooling. So we don't do book reports. I also don't follow a lot of set curriculum for reading. I know there's a lot of curriculum companies that actually have hardbound readers that you read short little stories, and it provides something for the kids to read every day. But let's face it, a lot of those short little stories just are very uninteresting. The characters are not very well developed, and the story, the plot itself is just dull. And so right about 1st grade, I stop giving my kids those curriculum assigned readers, because once they're about in 1st grade and they actually have enough skills developed to read on their own, they can read regular books just like the rest of us, the kind that have interesting characters and well-developed plots. And that really is what will cultivate a love for reading. A great story cultivates a love for reading. I also don't follow a lot of the pre-packaged literature kits that you can buy through really great curriculum companies like Sunlight and the Center for Lit and My Father's World. While I utilize their book lists for suggestions for things that my kids can be reading, I don't ever buy their prefab packages, because I don't ever want to be married to one particular reading plan. In other words, my child can read a book today and then come upon another book. Maybe a friend suggested a book to them, or they saw something online, or they heard about it at church or whatever, and they're really interested and want to read that book, but there's no time because we have to stick to the curriculum, we have to stick to the plan. And I think that sort of mentality, that sort of prepackaged book mentality, really negates the very goal that you're trying to attain, that love for reading. Well, I think those books are wonderful suggestions, and I always jot them down and write them down and have them in the back of my head. I don't really stick to a well-ordered plan. Usually, when my kids finish a book and it's time to start another one, I just go searching on my list of books that I think they might like, and I pick one that very day. I don't start my year out with a well-ordered plan of the books that I think that I want to get to for that year. And that might ebb and flow and change as my kids get older and reach high school, and they have to finish a certain books just to be able to graduate. But for now, we just get to our books very organically, whatever strikes our interest and whatever comes across our path, because that's truly how real lifelong readers read. People who have formed a love of reading over a lifetime, they don't follow necessarily a particular book list or a particular book plan. They just read the next thing. And so that's kind of how we tackle books around here. So I talked about the mom assigned readers. The other type of book that they have to be reading always in my home is a just for fun book or a pleasure book. It's just a book that they have chosen all on their own. Oftentimes I give them suggestions of books they might enjoy, just because that's what lifelong readers do. We have conversations about books. And I myself find it difficult to just walk into a library cold turkey and pull out a book I might like and enjoy. I usually pre-select my own books based on things I've read about or conversations I've had with friends. That's how lifelong readers choose books. And so I see nothing wrong with putting some suggestions out there for my kids to choose from, and that's also helping them learn to be discerning readers. I'm a big advocate for giving my children excellence in literature right out of the gate, so they begin to develop a taste for it, a craving for it. In the same way that I would not give my toddler brownies and cookies for a meal right out of the gate. I would give them broccoli and carrots and things that are good for them, so they develop right away, early on, a love and a taste for quality and excellence. And there's really nothing wrong with having sprinkles of twaddle books within your literary palette, but they should be few and far between. The majority, or the bulk, the meat of your reading and your child's reading should be excellent and quality and filled with great stories. So I see nothing wrong with suggesting some books for my kids to read for their just for fun reader. I might suggest 5 or 6 different books, and within those 5 or 6 different books, then they choose the one that they want to read. Now, that just for fun reader is simply that. I don't necessarily keep tabs or keep track of it, but I do want them to read from it every day. Now, that could come at the end of the day or in free time throughout the day, but I also find value in putting value on pleasure reading. If I, as a mom, am trying to encourage my kids to develop a love for reading, and I say that reading is important, but I don't actually set aside time in the day for it, I'm sort of just giving them lip service about the importance of books. I put value on math by scheduling it and carving out time in our day to do math. And so in that same way, I want to carve out time and schedule time in the day for my kids to read and be encouraged to read just for the sheer pleasure of it. And so right away, almost the first thing we do in the morning is we read together. After we come together and we have our morning time, which is something we do first thing in the morning, and I have written about that on my blog, so if you're curious about that, it's sort of like a glorified circle time. If you're curious about that, I will provide a link for you that you can read about our morning time. But after our morning time, we're all sort of congregated in the living room together already, so it's the perfect time to say, hey everybody go grab a book or a magazine or something that you're currently reading, come back together, spread out with pillows and blankets, and we're just going to snuggle and read our own individual book. We read for about 10 or 15 minutes, including myself. It's a great time for me to snuggle up and read a book that I'm interested in. And that way we get to see each other reading and see each other enjoying books. And after that time, not every day, but oftentimes we'll put down our books and just spend 1 or 2 minutes conversing about the books that we're reading. It's not very elaborate. It's usually just discussing what the title is, maybe the genre of the book, maybe the plot or the setting or something we like about the book. But it's a great time to begin formulating conversations centered around books. It gives my kids some vocabulary, helps them build that vocabulary that is necessary for discussing books. And then we just in that time and we disperse and we start our own individual learning endeavors. But that is a set time every day that my kids can bank on it. We're going to sit around and enjoy good books individually, because I want them to know how important it is. And so in order to do that, I have to carve out time in the day that is purposefully set aside just for pleasure reading. In addition to pleasure reading, we also have another time in the day that is set aside for reading together, and that's just after lunch. After we have our lunch and we kind of clean up from lunch and maybe we do a few chores, afternoon chores, we congregate again in the living room for our read aloud time, where we read books out loud together, or essentially I read out loud to them. During that time, to start out with, I read 2 picture books to all of the kids. And my older kids have kind of graduated beyond the need to read picture books together. And so sometimes they might be looking at a magazine while I'm reading, but they're in there in the living room with us. And that's a time really for my toddler and my now first grader to be able to enjoy some books simply on their level, and just the loveliness that happens with looking at and exploring picture books together. And that's a time for all of the kids to sort of pour into those younger ones and give prominence and importance to what they're reading, so that they, at their young level and their young stage, can begin to develop a love for books. So we read about 2 picture books together, and then I cart my toddler off and put him to bed and tuck him in tight for his nap. And while I'm tucking him in bed, my other kids know that they need to kind of scatter around the house and gather up some handwork activities. Maybe it's Legos, a Lego project they're working on, or for my daughter, maybe it's crocheting or what have you. Just a small handwork project that they can do for our read aloud time to sort of occupy their hands. I have written a post about handwork and what that looks like during read aloud time, and why that's such a value for read aloud time, and I'll provide a link for that as well, that blog post. So after I tuck in my son for his nap, I come back to the living room, and all the other kids have gathered and brought their handwork activities to the living room, and they begin their handwork, and I read out loud a chapter book. Now this is a chapter book that we have sort of voted on together as a family, usually at the beginning of the month. I give them maybe 5 or 6 different titles that I think they might be interested in reading together, and then we take a family vote, and everybody gets a vote, and the book that comes out on top with the most votes is the book that we read for that month, and we'll put the other books aside for maybe next month. It is helpful that I have a list of 5 or 6 books, and we go online, maybe Amazon or Goodreads, and read a little synopsis of each book to help them make their vote and make a more educated vote. So they vote on the book, and then we read it for that whole month. So at that time, I'm reading 1 chapter out loud to them, and they're doing their handwork. I don't usually allow a whole lot of discussion and a whole lot of talking during that time. They might have a question, maybe they didn't understand a word, or they didn't get to see the picture, or whatever. But I don't allow a lot of talking, and that's mostly because I have so many kids, and if they're all talking, I'd never get through the chapter. I don't do a whole lot of comprehension questions or a whole lot of discussion about the book. We're just reading for the sheer pleasure of reading. I might interrupt a page to just define a word that I know is unfamiliar to them. But for the most part, I'm just reading during that time. It's very often that at the end of the chapter, they'll say, "Mom, can we please read another chapter?" And I'm always game to sit and read another chapter. After that time, after our read aloud time, then we disperse again to our own independent learning endeavors, and we continue and finish up the rest of the school day. So those are 2 very specific times in the day where I have carved out and have purposed to set aside and devote for reading, because I find value in reading, and I want my kids to find value in reading. That's kind of how we do reading time in our homeschool. We also select a lot of curriculum based on the living literature style of education. So our history and our science and our Bible is all centered around great books. And so our home is filled with wonderful selections of great books. And I think that helps too, to help develop a family culture of books, that books are readily available to my kids to select from. Those are just a few thoughts on how to maybe carve out some time and schedule reading time within your home. I hope that gives you a few ideas. Please join me in the post where I share some helpful links and resources for choosing great books for your kids. Happy homeschooling.